It was just an ordinary evening, to be honest, nothing special. I had just finished work at the office, winding down after a long day. My name is Anani, I'm 35, and I run a small but growing company. I've hired quite a few people, but one of them, a 20-year-old guy who had just started working with me, was a little different. I didn't know him as well as I knew some of my other employees, but we got close in the first few weeks of his job. Brad wasn't just a regular intern. He was smart, hardworking, and a rather quiet guy. We got along well, nothing crazy, just the usual work routine. I mentored him a little here and there, and sometimes after work, I even gave him a ride home. On those drives, we talked a little, but mostly, I ended up chatting with his mom, Carolina, whenever I was around. I never thought much about it. She was a kind woman, and to be honest, she didn't look like she was in her late 40s at all. She was striking, well-kept, and carried herself with a confidence that was hard to ignore. Every time I dropped Brad off, she'd make coffee for us, and we'd talk about everything and nothing at all. To me, Carolina was just a friendly face, a good mother, nothing more. Or at least, that's what I thought. It was already quite late when my phone rang. I wasn't expecting anything, but when I checked, I saw an unfamiliar number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but something about it made me curious. I swiped and put the phone to my ear. "Hey, Anani." It was Carolina. "I made some bread." Her voice came through the line, waking my mind up in an instant. I was momentarily confused. Why was she calling me this late? "Hey, Carolina. Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated for a second. "I'm sorry for calling so late, but I'm in a bit of trouble. I'm out here, and I have no way to get home. Brad doesn't have the car, and I really need a ride. Could you pick me up?" She sounded a little flustered, and I could tell she wasn't in the best situation. I felt a little strange about it, but I also knew I couldn't leave her stranded. "Of course, I'll come get you." "Where are you?" I asked, already grabbing my keys and slipping on my jacket. "I'm at the old bar by the highway." "Meet me there," she said quickly. The bar wasn't far from where I lived, so it still wasn't a big deal. But I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something was off. I wasn't used to getting calls like this from a woman, especially someone I only knew as a colleague's mother. When I arrived, I parked and stepped out of the car. I looked around but didn't see any sign of Carolina. Then, from the side of the building, I saw her walking toward me. She wore a black coat, her hair styled perfectly, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. "Thank you so much for coming," she said as she reached my car. I didn't know who else to call. I nodded and opened the door for her. "No problem. Glad to help." She smiled as she slid into the passenger seat. "I really appreciate this," she said again, settling in. I started the car, ready to drive her home, but then she surprised me. "You know," she said, her tone playful, "it's still early. We could make this night a little more interesting. What do you think?" I blinked, unsure if I had heard her right. "What do you mean?" She chuckled lightly. "I just mean, we don't have to go straight home." She turned to look at me, her eyes glimmering with something I couldn't quite define. "How about we get a drink? Or even just drive around for a bit?" The suggestion caught me off guard, but it also intrigued me. This wasn't the kind of thing I expected from someone like her, especially right after picking her up. But there was something in the way she said it that made it hard to say no. "You want to go out?" I asked, slightly hesitant. She nodded, her smile growing. "Yes. Let's make a night to remember, Anani." The whole situation felt surreal, but I found myself agreeing. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but something about her presence made it impossible to refuse. As I drove into the night, I couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the evening had in store for us. I really had no idea what I was doing. There I was, driving Carolina through the dark, quiet streets with the night stretching ahead of us. I had no plan, no idea where we were going, but something about the way she looked at me earlier, with that spark in her eyes, kept me from turning back. She wasn't like anyone I had ever met before. She was confident, sure of herself, but in a way that made her feel approachable, warm. Even as we drove, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like we were both just waiting for something to happen. Then, she broke the silence. "How's work? You and Brad getting along all right?" Her voice was calm, casual, but something in it told me she wasn't just making small talk, she actually cared. "Yeah, everything's going well," I replied, keeping it light. "Brad's a good kid. Just getting used to things, you know? He's still learning, but I think he's got a lot of potential." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad he has someone like you to help him. He can be a little unsure of himself sometimes." "I get that," I said, glancing at her briefly. "He just needs time to grow." She smiled, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "And what about you, Anani? How are you?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't really thought about that. "I've been busy, you know," I shrugged. "But good. Ups and downs, like always." I felt the weight of her gaze on me. This wasn't just a casual question. She was looking at me in a way that made me feel seen. "You know," she said after a moment of silence, "I've always admired your determination. You've built something, and that's not easy. A lot of people talk about it, but not everyone follows through." My heart skipped a beat. Was she flirting with me? I wasn't sure, but the compliment made me feel good in a way I hadn't expected. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "It's been hard, but it's worth it." She smiled again, but this time it felt different. There was something in the way she looked at me, something almost personal. "Well," she said, her voice low, "it's rare to find someone like you." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just kept driving. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing moment. Eventually, we arrived at a small, quiet bar, nothing fancy, just a dimly lit place with a few scattered patrons. Carolina turned to me, her expression serious now. "Are you okay with this?" she asked, her voice almost challenging. I nodded, trying to act normal. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, wasn't expecting this when I picked you up." She laughed lightly, the sound smooth and almost musical. "I know it's a little spontaneous, but I think that's what makes it fun, don't you?" I wasn't sure if I agreed, but something about her made me want to follow her lead. And as we stepped inside, I had the feeling that tonight would be different. That attraction arose between us. We talked about everything, work, life, even the small, silly things. But now, there was an awkward silence, and I wasn't sure how to fill it. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she was the first to break the silence. Her voice was softer, more intimate. "You're different from the other men I know," she said, almost thoughtfully. "You're genuine. I mean, really real. Not just pretending to be something." I wasn't sure how to respond to that compliment. Maybe I shifted in my seat a little, uncomfortable with how she made me feel. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. It was rare, but I respected it. Most people try to impress or pretend in life, she didn't. "I guess I'm just me," I said, trying to sound casual. But I knew she could see through the indifference. Her lips curled into a smile, and I couldn't help but admire her. Even at 48, she radiated youth and strength. She didn't seem like a woman who had been through hardships, she seemed like someone who had lived fully, experienced everything, and still carried a fire inside her. "You know," she said, her voice turning playful, "I haven't done anything spontaneous in a long time. Maybe tonight is the night to change that." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Maybe we shouldn't just sit here all night. I've been cooped up at home too long. Let's go somewhere unexpected. A little adventure." Her suggestion hung in the air. For a moment, I just stared at her. This wasn't the kind of invitation you usually got from someone like her, the type of woman who had everything. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she didn't need to have everything anymore. Maybe, just for tonight, she wanted to break free and do something different. A part of me wanted to say no, to keep things normal and safe. But another part of me couldn't resist the idea of a spontaneous night. "I'm listening," I said, leaning in, curious. Her eyes lit up. "Dancing?" "Just for a little while." "I haven't danced in ages." I couldn't help but smile. Not what I expected, but it sounded like exactly what we both needed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked, teasing, even though I was already leaning toward saying yes. She grinned. "Let's live a little. I promise it'll be fun." And just like that, the night took a turn I wasn't prepared for, but I found myself excited. We finished our drinks, paid, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city buzzed around us, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as if anything could happen. We found a club not far from the bar, where the music pounded deep in your chest and the lights flashed in a hazy glow. It wasn't really my scene, but that didn't matter. Not tonight. Not with her. We walked through the doors, and for a moment, I thought this might be a disaster. But then, Carolina took my hand and led me to the dance floor. And suddenly, everything else disappeared, the music, the crowd, the people. It was just us. Her movements were graceful, her energy contagious. It wasn't about the dancing, it was about her confidence, her ability to let go and enjoy the moment. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself doing the same. I wasn't thinking about anything, not work, not responsibilities, not anything else. Just her. Just the energy between us. We danced for what felt like hours. We laughed. We moved together. And in those moments, something shifted. The attraction I'd felt earlier was no longer just physical. It was something deeper. Something real. As the song ended, we stood there, breathless, but smiling. She looked at me, her eyes shining. "See? I told you it would be fun," she said, slightly out of breath. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My heart pounded, and I wasn't sure what was happening. But I knew one thing, tonight had changed everything. The club was a whirlwind of lights, music, energy. We let ourselves get lost in it. But as the night faded, the noise of the world seemed to quiet. It was just Carolina and me, caught in a shared moment that felt like it existed outside of time. And when the night finally came to an end, neither of us was ready to let it go. After leaving the club, we didn't talk much. The streets were quiet, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. As we drove out of the city, a sense of peace settled over us, but it was different from before. We had crossed a threshold. And now, we were in this space where everything felt different. Carolina, who had been so confident and in control all night, glanced at me briefly as we drove. Her eyes met mine. And in them, I saw a quiet understanding, something unspoken. Something deeper still lingered between us. She didn't say a word, but I could feel it. An invitation. Just to follow wherever this led. No questions. No judgments. We arrived at a small motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't fancy, but that wasn't the point. I parked the car, and for a moment, we just sat there, unmoving, as if the weight of the night had suddenly settled on us. Carolina looked at me again. "I think we both know where this is going, don't we?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost hesitant. I didn't have an answer. What I felt wasn't something I could easily put into words. It wasn't about the decision to come here. It was about everything that had led us to this moment. A night that had unfolded in a way neither of us had planned, yet somehow, it felt right. We stepped out of the car without another word and walked into the motel room. The door clicked shut behind us. And that's when everything became quiet. I didn't know what to expect from the night. There was no script, no plan. Just two people who had come together in a way neither of us had predicted. The night passed in a blur of words and unspoken glances, saying all the things we didn't need to say out loud. We spent hours together, but the details didn't matter. What mattered was that it felt real. Like we were just two people, unbound by age or circumstances, connected by something deeper. Something we hadn't been searching for, yet had found anyway. When morning came, the world outside was quiet, bathed in the soft light of dawn. I woke up to find Carolina sitting by the window, gazing out as the world slowly came alive. There was a calmness in her that I couldn't quite describe, but it was beautiful. She turned to look at me. And in that moment, I saw the same understanding in her eyes. As if we had shared something that didn't need to be explained. We didn't talk much as we got dressed. The silence between us spoke louder than any words. There was no need to ask what would happen next. We both knew things had changed. But neither of us was in a hurry to define where this would lead. It wasn't about labels or expectations. It was about the connection we had made. When we finally left the room, we didn't say much on the drive back. But when I pulled up in front of her house, she looked at me, her gaze soft, almost grateful. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her voice steady but sincere. "I didn't expect any of this. But I'm glad it happened." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was too much I didn't understand. Too much I wasn't ready to admit. But I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. She gave me a small smile, a quiet goodbye, and stepped out of the car. I watched her walk inside, the door closing behind her. And I sat there for a few minutes, letting everything sink in. I wasn't sure what would happen next. But I knew that whatever it was, it had started here. Tonight. And though I didn't have all the answers, I couldn't deny it. Something had changed between us. Something that had the potential to be more than either of us had ever imagined. Until one afternoon when we were working late at the office, and I couldn't bear it anymore. We were sitting in the break room, a cup of coffee between us. The soft hum of the office sounded distant compared to the noise in my head. I had to say something. "You've been quiet lately," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Carolina looked up from her coffee, her eyes meeting mine. "Just thinking," she replied with a small smile. "Sometimes it's easier to think when the world is a little quieter." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face, trying to read what was behind her calm expression. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of coffee, as if she were weighing something in her mind. After a moment, she set her cup down, her fingers lingering on the handle. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And everything that's happened between us?" I felt my heart skip a beat. For a second, I thought I had imagined it, but when I looked into her eyes, I saw the truth. She felt it too. The same confusion I had tried to ignore. My voice was hoarse, and I had to clear my throat. "I don't know what to do about this." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "I don't either," she admitted. "But I can't ignore it. And I don't want to." There was something terrifying about admitting what we felt. It was real. Undeniable. I couldn't run from it anymore. "I never thought this would happen," I said, my words almost sounding like an apology. "I never thought it would be you. But here we are," Carolina said, a soft, genuine smile spreading across her lips. We sat there in silence for a while, letting the weight of what we had just said settle. There was no rush. No pretending this wasn't happening. For the first time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused. I knew how I felt about her. And I could see that she felt the same. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that had quietly grown between us. And now that it was out in the open, I couldn't deny it. "Do you think we're making a mistake?" I asked, my voice low. Carolina shook her head, her expression serious. "No," she said evenly. "I think we're just trying to figure it out. Like everyone else. But what we have, it's not a mistake." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. It was like permission, like she was telling me that we could do this, whatever this was. It didn't have to be perfect, but it could be real. We sat there a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if we had always been on this path, and only now were we truly taking the first steps. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Carolina. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, I wasn't afraid. Whatever was happening between us was real, and that was all that mattered. It's funny how life works. You think you have everything figured out, and then something completely unexpected comes along and changes everything. That's how it was with Carolina. I never imagined that one chance encounter, one late-night conversation, would lead to something this real. But here we were, sitting together in my apartment, her in my arms, and I felt like, for the first time, everything was falling into place. The past few weeks had been a blur. We had spent nearly every moment together, and each one felt like it was meant to happen. I know it sounds crazy, but it was true. Every time I looked at Carolina, I saw something new, something more than I could have ever expected. Like each day with her was a gift, something I never thought I'd have. We had talked a lot these past few weeks. About everything. About how this all started, how unexpected it was. But mostly, we talked about what we wanted now, what we wanted from each other, from life. I never thought I'd find someone like you, I told her one night, my voice softer than usual. She smiled, her eyes warm as she looked at me. Me neither, she said. But here we are. We talked about the future and what it might look like. We knew it wouldn't be perfect, but that wasn't the point. The point was that we had something real, something strong, something that had somehow, against all odds, found its way into our lives. We weren't rushing anything. We didn't need to. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was about the quiet moments, the laughter, the small touches, the way we understood each other without saying much. The way she rested her head on my shoulder when we watched movies, or how I caught her looking at me, her expression soft, as if she were trying to understand me, though we both knew there was nothing to understand. We just fit. I realized, in some way, we were both healing, from past mistakes, from old wounds, from things we didn't even know we needed to heal from. And we were doing it together, piece by piece. We were building something stronger than either of us had before. It wasn't always easy. We had disagreements, like any couple. But every time we argued, every time we didn't see eye to eye, I never doubted that we were still in this together. We talked, we worked through it, and we kept moving forward. Because it's not about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you better. And I knew that's what we had. One evening, as we sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Carolina turned to me, her expression serious. For the first time in a long time, she said, her voice quiet but steady, I know we've been doing this for a while now, but I think we're ready. I think I'm ready to say that I want this. I want us. I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest, something swelling inside me that I couldn't quite name. I'm ready, I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. I want this. I want you. And in that moment, everything made sense. No more hesitation. No more doubt. Just us. Choosing each other. Knowing this was something we both wanted. This wasn't a perfect love story. But it didn't need to be. We had found something real. Something that made sense in a way nothing else ever had. And when I looked at Carolina, her eyes shining with the same certainty I felt in my chest, I knew, this was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't worried about it. We had built something solid. We had found each other in the most unexpected way. And somehow, that made it even more special. We didn't need grand declarations or a perfect plan. We had each other. And that was enough. As we stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the world before us, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. We had found each other. And that was all that mattered.